Last week we began the 7th chapter of Kohelet. So again, that's chapter 7 of the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. And we actually only did one verse. And I actually kind of planned it like that because as I've pointed out in the past, there's a natural break that occurs. In the text of Kohelet, you will notice that there's actually a break that occurs at the end of the 6th chapter going into the 7th chapter. Now this break, we can only assume comes from King Solomon himself, or there's if you were to look at it in a scroll version, you will notice that there's an actual break in the letters. There's almost like a paragraph ending and a new paragraph beginning. I mentioned last week that this is actually very rare in the book of Kohelet. While it's very common throughout the rest of Tanakh, in the book of Kohelet itself only happens twice. So the way we've been interpreting that is that King Solomon's intention was to give us, with 2 breaks, you end up with 3 paragraphs. The first one being just an intro at the beginning of the book. I believe it's just about 8 verses before the first break. Then we have this long block of text all the way till the 7th chapter. And then we have the second block of text starting at the 7th chapter and going to the end of the book. So in that sense, we kind of came to this understanding that there's, again, that first there's those intro verses, then there's kind of book 1 and then there's book 2. So book 1 is what we've been discussing all until now, or until last week. I'm sorry, which has been a long discussion about happiness, about how to achieve happiness and how to, what we can do in the material world, again, not in the spiritual world, but in the material world to achieve happiness from everything around us. As we saw, there was a consistent mention of Tachat HaShamesh, that we're talking about under the sun, and specifically how to achieve happiness through the material world. And he's given us a lot of food for thought about that. Spent a long time talking about wealth and what that does for us, and he talked about power and a number of other factors that we often will correlate to happiness, but in reality, he tells us with his wisdom and his experience, he tells us that those are not necessarily keys to happiness. They may play a role, but they're not direct keys to happiness. So that was a long discussion that we've had. It would probably be worthwhile reviewing it at some point, just kind of summarizing it. But at this point, we're just kind of moving on. Now we're moving on to what I would call part B of the book of Kohelet. And that starts at chapter 7. And as I mentioned last week, it's kind of unclear what his focus is. He kind of immediately jumps into a discussion, and which is not his style. Again, we've seen that he's a big fan of introductions. He introduced the entire book with 8 verses. He introduced part A with a bunch of other verses also. So it seemed out of character for him to go ahead and then just start telling us things. As I mentioned last week, it's possible he could just be rattling off the wisdom of Solomon, but he has a whole nother book that he wrote for that. That's the book of Proverbs, the book of Mishlei. All right, so it would be uncharacteristic of him to not be giving us an introduction to what he wants to talk about. And again, as somebody who's so organized and with such wisdom, it would be irresponsible to say that he's not giving us something in a specific order and following a specific system. So when we looked at it last week, we looked at chapter 7, verse 1, and we saw that he actually starts to introduce a topic. Now, he is doing it in kind of a funny way. He's not directly addressing what topic he's going to be discussing, but what seems to be is that he's going to be talking about the idea of interpersonal relationships. And the first thing he throws out at us is the idea of maintaining a reputation, okay? We're not going to spend too much time on that first verse because, again, that was last week's class. If you'd like to check that out, I invite you to check out our link, which I just posted in the chat. All right, that's our link to our Facebook, our internet page, our website page, and you can check out there. It should be up now. If not, then it will be up in the coming days. Last week's class. So without any further ado, let's go into the share screen now, and we start taking a look at the following verses. Okay, we're going to be starting with verse number 2 now. Okay, but just because I can't go without at least reading verse number 1. It just says Tov Shem Mishem and Tov. Plays a little word game over there. That a name, a reputation, is better than good oil. V'yom hamavet miom hivaldo, and the day of death is greater than the day of birth. And we actually explained last week that, of course, King Solomon's not trying to bring us down. He's trying to encourage us forward. And we had an explanation about why that is. And that when you look at somebody who's passed away at the moment of their death, you get to see a full picture of the person. And that's when all the versions of a person's reputation that they go through, all the things that a person presents themselves throughout their life, it all culminates with that Yom HaMavet, the day of the death. And once that happens, then you get to see the full picture of the human being, as opposed to a child who's newly born. That child it's a big question mark. We don't know what that kid is going to be, who that kid is going to be, what they're going to grow up to be. So it's all in potential. It's not an actuality. And that is, in that sense, when we're trying to look and create these relationships with people, we want to look at the whole person and see what they are at the culmination of everything that they are. Okay. Again, that was last week's verse. So we will jump now directly into verse number 2. And this is chapter 7, verse number 2. We center that on the page there. Let me make it just a bit bigger. There we go. It's a little easier. Okay. And let me center that a little bit better. There we go. Okay. So we say like this, kind of following the same theme, but shifting focus a little bit. He says, Tov, it is good, lalachet el beit evel, to go to the house of mourning, milachet el beit mishtat, then to go to the house of drinking. Ba'asher hu sof kol adam, in that it is the end of all people, of all humanity. V'hachai yitin el libo, and the one who is living will put it on their heart. Will focus that on their heart. Okay. Once again, let's read it all together once again. Tov lalechet el beit evel. It is better to go to the house of mourning, milechet el beit mishtet, than to go to the house of drinking. Ba'asher, in that hu sof kol ha'adam, it is the end of all humanity. V'hachai yitin el libo, and the living person will put it on their heart, will focus themselves on this matter. Okay, so again, another great example of a case where Kohelet is going to look to be a downer on face value, and we're going to try to glean something a little more encouraging from what he's saying over here. On the face value, he seems to be saying that it's better for a person to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of drink, than to go to a house of drink, because you get to focus on the end of life, on the end of a person, and so there's a number of takes we could take with this. In fact, I was surprised. Very often, I will lean towards the explanation of the Mitzudah, who's one of the main commentators on Tanakh. And in this case, I wanted to veer away from what he said. He says over here, he goes with kind of the simple understanding. If you go to the house of mourning, then you see what's important in life. You focus on what's important in life, and you don't focus on the distractions. And you will align yourself towards teshuvah, towards becoming a better person, towards repentance. Now, that is true. That is definitely a good thing to do, and it's an important thing to do. And I'm not going to downplay that that's a important aspect of life, to focus on what happens in the end of our time. In the end of the day, we all end up in a certain place, and it's worthwhile to consider that we're on our way there eventually. God willing, in a long time, but there's something to that. I want to make that clear. That's a very important factor. In fact, there's a number of our sages throughout history who have said that that's kind of the most important thing to keep in mind is that we're here for a limited time, and we're focused on some greater goal that lives beyond this world, and that we're trying to achieve. Okay, and that is important. In the context of what we're trying to do here and what we're seeing from these verses, I think he's really coming to tell us a little bit different of a lesson. And I was actually surprised to find that it's Rashi who is enlightening us in this one, because again, if you followed our system throughout this, I've often veered away from Rashi's explanation because he's very Talmudic in his way of taking the verses, and there's not necessarily a flow of context. But over here, he actually his explanation really kind of is very enlightening over here, and that is that he says that he actually gives a number of explanations. Again, in the way of the sages, that they give a number of explanations, all geared around one verse. So over here also, he gives us a number of explanations. And one of the things that he says is that if a person goes to a house of mourning, well, a house of mourning is a place that everyone has to contend with at some point. Everyone must face a house of mourning at some point. Everyone in their lives, or at the end of their lives, will be the subject of a house of mourning. Okay, as opposed to a house of drink, a house of happiness. Not everyone gets an opportunity to achieve simcha, to achieve happiness. Not everyone gets an opportunity to, let's not say achieve, right? We have a whole system, that's part A of the book, of how to achieve happiness. But not everyone gets an opportunity to celebrate happiness. Not everybody gets a chance to get married, or to make a brit milah, or to make birthdays, or not everyone gets that opportunity. So in that sense, when he says that it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of drink, that what he's saying is there's a way that you can connect with every single person. There's a way to make connections with other people, and that is with finding common ground. So it's kind of a shift in how we look at this verse over here. He says it's better to go to the house of mourning because that's something that everyone has to contend with at some point. So it's a common denominator that we all share. And when we're looking to make connections, to create relationships with other people, we actually want to look for the thing that affects all of us. I'm constantly not surprised, but fascinated by small talk. I don't love small talk. It drives me nuts. I'm not a very good small talker. I will very quickly dive into a deeper conversation with somebody. That's just my personality. But and I've always kind of gone into small talk with an open eye. What do we talk about when we have small talk? We talk about more than anything, usually the weather, because the weather is a factor that it's a common denominator that we all share. You walk outside, we're all sharing the same weather. We're all getting the sunshine or the rain or whatever it is. So in that sense, we all seem to be able to, we all go to that as our connector. We like to, we're going to talk about the weather. Sometimes it's politics too, because that in many cases does affect all of us. During COVID, it was COVID, right? That was our small talk. I remember my wife and I, we made a rule at our Shabbat table that we can have no COVID discussions at a certain point, just because it was so ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And so that's actually, it's a trick. It's not a trick. It's a strategy, is what King Solomon is telling us, is that when we want to make connections with other people, look for the thing that affects all of us. It may even be something as dreary as a Beit Evel, the house of mourning, but in reality, that's an important thing that we want to do, is we want to find the thing that connects us as opposed to divides us when you're dealing with other people. Again, as opposed to a Beit Mishta, not everyone gets a chance to celebrate something, yeah. So, for example, like just actually this week at Kesser, I myself am sponsoring the Kiddush, but I'm sponsoring it for my father's Yortzeit. So it's like it's a chance to celebrate, but it's also a big Evel. It's kind of interesting mix of the two. So we all get a chance to celebrate a Beit Evel. We don't all get a chance to celebrate a Beit Mishta. Okay, that is one factor, or one idea that Rashi over here points out. He gives us another idea also, and that is that just looking at my notes here for a second. Yeah, right. The sages over here, again, Rashi actually quotes the sages over here, and they tell us that why is it important for a person? Why is it better for a person to go to a Beit Evel? Why is it better for a person to go to the house of mourning than to the house of happiness? And he says, because, or the sages say, because when a person goes to a house of mourning, they get to see, okay, so this person is being eulogized. And you know what? That's how I want to be eulogized. Or that's not how I want to be eulogized. Or that's how this person was, that's how this person's funeral was done. That's how this person was treated and respected in the end of their life. And you know what? I want to do that too. And they actually, the way they put it is, since I want to be given that respect when I pass away, I'm going to give that respect to the other people when they pass away, which is actually an interesting idea, because what they're saying is that because again this is such a common factor, and because this is a common denominator that we all share, it puts an obligation on me. I go to a house of mourning and I get a chance to see what other people have and what they deal with, and I say, you know what, I want to help them. And it may be not fully altruistic, it may be for an ulterior motive, that I want that for myself one day. You know, I was always taught that your children will treat you the way you treat your own parents. That's kind of a way I was taught. I don't know if it comes from anywhere in particular. Maybe it comes from here itself. I don't know, but that's a kind of a quote that I always heard growing up. That your person is their person's children will treat them the way that they treat their own parents, and it's kind of that same thing over here. A person will be buried in the way that they bury other people. A person will be eulogized in the way that they eulogize other people. Again, that's how the sages put this idea over here. And so again, it's a similar idea, kind of that it's connecting through the common factor, and even introducing that ulterior motive. But if that's for the right purpose, that is a good thing. It's a better thing. In fact, this is again one of those times where King Solomon starts off a verse with the word tov, that it's good, meaning he's giving a stamp of approval on this thing. And he's saying that sometimes, or it is in general, better for a person to go to the house of mourning and to prompt themselves to become a better person, not just because they know that they're also facing the same end at some point, but in the fact that they want certain things when that happens. They want certain respect and certain care to be taken with them. And in that case, that's gonna push them to do that with other people. And again, that's all in the big context of how do we connect with other people. That's another strategy, I would say, not a trick, a strategy. It's a way that we are able to connect with other people, is realize that it's kind of that golden rule, right? Treat other people how you want to be treated yourself. And that's really what we're doing over here. What King Solomon's telling us is, think about yourself. How would you want to be treated at that point in your existence? And use that as a guide for how you'd want to treat other people. Okay. The last thing that Rashi points out over here, just also kind of an interesting idea, is that when a person goes to the house of mourning, when a person goes to the funeral of a friend, God forbid, when that happens, that's the last thing you could do with that person. It's the actual last thing, last chesed, last kindness that you could do for a friend, is to go to their funerals, to go to their, or to be involved in the process of laying them to rest at the end of the days, as opposed to going to a beit mishpat. Person makes a party, right? A person makes a birthday party, or a brit for their child, or a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah or anything like that. So you always have in your back pocket this ability to say, I'll miss this one, but I'll make it to the next one. They're going to make another party at some point. However, there's a difference when a person goes to a beit eval, a person goes to a funeral, because that is the last time, that's the last chance that a person has to honor and respect and be there to recognize a friend. And it's kind of a sad, comforting thought, I guess, is that we just never really know when's the last time that we are there for this friend. We're never really sure when that time is going to be. When's our last chance to see this other person? I mean, that's, again, it's a sobering thought, but it's also an encouraging thought, because what it does is it says, when you're dealing with another person and when you're trying to create connections, try to think of them as somebody who, or try to avoid the excuses and the way to back out of the situation. It's not a direct, obviously we all have things in our lives that we can't necessarily make it to every simcha, every party that everybody makes. But at the same time, it is good to kind of consider that there's opportunities to do kindness with other people. Yeah, just on a personal note, as I mentioned, my father's yahrzeit is coming up, and we had a very interesting experience because the days leading up to his passing, we didn't even know that he was going to be, leaving us soon. And very, very, very similar to this, we didn't know that it was really a beit avel, not a beit mishtet. But it was kind of an interesting experience because all of his friends had kind of showed up in the days before. Some here, some there, just it was really kind of an interesting thought, because when we were sitting there at his funeral and during the Shiva, and just kind of thinking about how, wow, they had all kind of showed up in these last couple of days, all of his really close friends. But the truth is, we just never know. We never know when that friend is going to. Yeah, I don't need to say any more on that. All this is with the intention that Bahachai, the person who's living, obviously living would be deeper than just alive. Somebody who's thinking, alive, is alive with life, Yitain El Libo, will put it on their minds, will keep it on their hearts and on their minds, these things. Again, it's kind of three lessons that we learn from here. Number one is to try to reach out to people on a where we have common ground, right? We all face certain challenges, so try to reach out to them and where we all have common ground. Number two being that we should think about how we would want to be treated in a similar situation when we deal with other people. And third is that we should consider that we never know when's our last interaction with somebody, and we would not want to leave on a sour note with somebody. So those are three kind of mini lessons, all wrapped up in this one verse. And again, this is all three explanations that Rashi gives. So again, this is in the larger context of creating better interactions between people. These are kind of three mini lessons. I do believe that we're still in the intro section to this part of the book. So I think he's going to be fleshing out each one of these ideas later in the coming chapters. But he's kind of just giving us a little drop of like what to expect. I mentioned last week that in the first couple verses here of chapter 7, we've got like 5, 6, 7 verses that all start with this word tov, good. And we've said in the past that tov is usually his culminating, like after discussing the whole idea, he says tov this. And here he's actually starting off with a bunch of them. And I think he's doing just the backwards of that, where he's giving us a bunch of major lessons, and he's going to flesh them out in the coming verses, in the coming chapters. With that, we will move on to verse number 3. Okay. And that is over here in the center of the page. And he says again, tov, another thing that's good. Now this one's hard. This one's a bit of a doozy. He says, tov ka'as misachok. Better is anger than laughter. Kivaroa panim mitav leit. Because with a bad face, a heart is made better. Now, that's a hard verse to swallow. It's hard to even comprehend. Let me read that again. Tov ka'as misachok. Anger is better than laughter. Kivaroa panim mitav leit. Because with a bad face, with a harsh face, it improves the heart. Okay? And again, we're talking about trying to improve relationships with other people. And he's saying better to be angry than to be happy, than to be laughing, which is again very hard thing to swallow and to kind of understand what he's saying over here. And I've noticed that there are a number of translations that do not translate ka'as as anger. They instead will translate ka'as as seriousness or sadness or something like that. Sadness is better than happiness, and that goes with that old-timey or traditional explanation of the book of Kohelet being a downer of a book. But I don't think that, first of all, that's not what the word ka'as means. Ka'as does not mean sad. It does not mean dark. It means anger, specifically anger. So that's just, and also that doesn't actually fit with how we understand the purpose of the book. So what is that he's saying over here? And again, actually over here, the commentaries really pick up the slack for us. They really introduce again, another important idea. And that is, we're talking about a specific case, even though it's not actually spoken out, but the commentaries kind of fill the void over here. And so we're talking about a specific case. Cases where you are angry at someone. You're dealing with somebody who's not making you very happy. And that situation, you have two ways to approach this person. Way number one is through laughter, is through passive aggression, is through trying to ignore something and cover up your feelings with a smile, with happiness, with laughter. And here he tells us, and again, this is counterintuitive a little bit, but it's also not. He says better than that is to actually treat the person with anger. If a person is harboring anger in their heart at somebody, it's actually better to express that anger. Now, that doesn't mean you should get into a fight. It doesn't mean you should never talk to the person. It doesn't mean any of those things. But it is better that the person airs out the things that they're feeling and airs out their grievances with another person. The sages tell us, not on this verse, it's actually in relation to the story of Joseph and his brothers. It says that the brothers of Joseph were unable to speak favorably about Joseph. This is before he got sold, and when he was telling stories to Jacob about his brothers. It says that the brothers were unable to say good things about him. And the sages actually declare over there that that was a praise of the brothers, of Joseph's brothers, not because obviously we don't like a fight between brothers, and that was a terrible incident that led to years of slavery for the Jewish people and all sorts of, troubles and trials and tribulations. However, they do speak out over there that if a person is not happy with another person, it's better for you to air that out with the other person, to actually confront the other person and to have that conversation. In that case, again, tov kas mischok, anger is better than laughter.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure.
There's a definite echo from Mishlei in this verse.
Okay.
I seem to remember somewhere in Mishlei that he's talking about interacting with other people and being true to yourself in your interactions with them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that earlier, that, Mishlei is kind of a guide for living.
Right.
And here, there's a definite echo here to me.
Yeah, I can't recall specific which verses you'd be referring to in Mishlei, but I'd have to take a look at it. It's been a while since I've taken a look at it.
Mishlei's kind of long. I couldn't tell you which verse it was either, but
sure.
Something is striking a chord. I just wanted to
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, this again, this being the Wisdom of Solomon, two different books of the Wisdom of Solomon, would make sense that there's correlations between the two of them.
Right.
Yeah. So, but again, and this is the primary lesson that we're getting from this verse over here, is that it's important for a person to air out those grievances. And not only is it important, it's good, it's better, but he actually explains that he plays it through. He says, "Kivaroa panim," because with a bad face, with an angry face, with a yitav lei, that will actually improve relationships. It will improve the heart between two people. If a person actually has a chance to go and air out and say what's on their minds, and you treat people with the respect, with the dignity of being honest with them about your feelings, that it will improve a relationship between those people. I had a family member who unfortunately harbored a lot of anger to a lot of different people in their family. Just a specific family member I think of. And by the end of their life, they had just a bunch of, all their close friends had, or many of their close friends had distance from them. Actually, they outlived all of them. They outlived all of their friends. But this family member had a lot of unspoken grievances, and it was very sad to see, because all those friends and all those opportunities to maintain those friendships fell away. And if he had just said to those people what it was that was bothering him, he could have worked it out. Very often we build up in castles in our mind of what it is that we're dealing with and what we're angry about. In reality, the other person just didn't know, or has their own grievances that they're not saying, and it just takes a moment to work it out. I actually took a course in conflict management, and confrontation is basically step number one. You want to bring two people together, two people who have an issue with each other. You want to bring them together. The sages tell us about Aaron, the brother of Moses, who used to, when two people were fighting, he'd go to each one of them and say he wants to make up, and he'd go to the other guy and say he wants to make up. Really, neither of them wanted to make up, but he was able to at least get them in the same room, and then they could have a conversation. So he actually used deceit to do that. Again, kind of an interesting method to bringing peace between people. But it is important for people to create dialogue and to have conversations. And that's really the only way that we can do this. So here we have almost, again, kind of another mini lesson where he's now telling us honesty. Be honest in your relationships. Be honest in the way in how you treat people. And if you have something, don't cover it up with laughter. Express it, even with anger. And we know anger is a terrible thing, right? It's all throughout our books that anger is one of the worst things you can deal with. And still, he says, better to air out that anger than to be covering it up with laughter. To be covering it up and laughter, not happiness, by the way. It's not happiness over here. It's specifically laughter. We're not talking about actual mirth. We're talking about somebody who's just covering up something with laughter. And that is not a good way to deal with it. The sages over here also point out that this is how, in many ways, how God deals with us. How sometimes he shows us his disappointment, and it's to bring us towards something greater. And it says that the generation of the flood, in times of Noah, they never really experienced that. They just were able to go on and on and on and on with their wickedness until finally God had his retribution. And in that sense, they didn't, Hashem, so to speak, never aired out their issue until it reached the boiling point. And if they had the opportunity to repent, it would have been different. Again, that's a much more big picture Torah idea, but in this sense, again, but just in regards to interpersonal relationships, seems to be what he's saying. I want to do verse number 4 also, so let's move on to verse number 4. Again, these are all kind of intros, mini intro lessons. And I found this one very interesting because he says over here, Lev chachamim beveit evel, the heart of the wise is in the house of the mourner. V'lev kisilim beveit simcha. And the heart of the fool is in the house of happiness. Again, Lev chachamim beveit evel, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. V'lev kisilim beveit mishtek. I keep on saying mishtek because that was in the previous verse. And beveit simcha is in the house of happiness. I did not realize when I was prepping this that there's a shift in the wording over there. That's something I would have to put a little more thought into before I could respond to why that is. You switch from Beit Nishtet to Beit Simcha, from a house of drink to a house of happiness. But I'll have to shelf that for right now because I did not pick up on that before. But I did find it interesting. He's repeating the general idea he said 2 verses ago. Again, in verse number 2, he said it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of drink, because that's the end of the person. In that, it's the end of the person, and the living one was able to focus on that. And then he tells us 2 verses later that the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, and the heart of the fools is in the house of happiness. Now, why is it that he's repeating the same lesson again? That's kind of what bothered me with this. And I was racking my brain, and I was going through the commentaries to kind of try and figure out, not only is it a repetition of 2 verses ago, but there was a verse in the middle. And I couldn't figure out why there's that verse in the middle either. I have kind of my own take on it, which, again, I didn't see this anywhere else, but it kind of stood out to me. And that's I noticed that as I was reading it over and over again, like I just did right now, I kept on stumbling on the words, because he does something he doesn't usually do over here, or that he goes against one of the conventional styles of Hebrew. Is that usually in this type of situation it would have been written like this: Lev chacham beveit evel, the heart of the wise person is in the house of mourning. V'lev kisil beveit simcha, and the heart of the fool is in the house of happiness. But he doesn't say the heart of the wise person or the heart of the fool in singular. Rather, he says it's the heart of the wise in plural, chachamim, the plural of the sages, of the wise people, is in the house of mourning, and the heart of the fools, again plural, is in the house of happiness. And kind of what I thought about this was like this. Again, we're dealing with not a tense shift, but a shift in plural, singular to plural. It's not the hearts of the wise, plural. It's the singular heart of the plural wise people and the singular heart of the plural fools. So again, it's kind of this funny thing. It could just be prose. He's speaking in a poetic way. But I think there's actually something deeper that he's bringing to us over here, is that when people as a whole, when a group of people gather in the house of mourning, when we all go to a house of mourning to deal and face that reality, what it does is it unites ourselves as wise people. A group of people who go together to the house of mourning, we all walk out a little more wise. We've all kind of unified, again, Lev, that singular heart, as a group of chachamim. The same people could go to a house of happiness and be ksilim and be fools. It's not a judgment necessarily on the person themselves. They are not a chacham or a kasil, a wise person or a fool. What you find over here is that people in a house of mourning tend to be chachamim. They tend to be more wise, more somber, more thought through, thinking about what they're doing, as opposed to people in a house of happiness tend to live an existence that is more foolish. Again, I believe that we could be talking about the same people. In fact, the same people. When you go to the house of mourning, it will wisen you up. Wise you up to life. It will help you be a little bit wiser. And when the same person, goes to the house of happiness, you kind of meld with the people around you and become a little more foolish. There's I remember seeing in a book once that when people are all dancing together, draw people into the circle, because even if they're not happy, it will make them happy. And that's likely to be true. But I think it's also, and I think that's kind of what he's addressing over here, is that you will find yourself in two different situations. When you're in the house of happiness, you kind of get drawn with the crowd, and you can become foolish with that. And again, fool in this case, kasil, seems to connotate this idea of your senses are blocked. You get your senses blocked out, and you can't notice things around you. In the house of happiness, it's very easy to get myopic and just kind of like you're overstimulated, and you can't think about what's important in life. As opposed to the Beit Evel, where you're in a house of mourning, it opens your heart up to becoming a wiser person. That's kind of how I understood this verse over here. So it's not a repetition of the verse two verses ago. He said, yes, it's important to go to a house of mourning, and you're going to be better off for that. And he gave us a number of reasons for that. But here I think he's giving us a different lesson. And that is what, for you yourself, how to become wise or foolish. A lot of that has to do with your surroundings, where you find yourself at a specific period of time. And the same person can be a wise person in the house of mourning and be a foolish person in the house of happiness. So I think that's kind of the sense and the lesson that he's trying to give us over here. Again, not much is actually mentioned in the commentaries. This is kind of my own take on it. But I think it's correct. It's not lev chacham, that a wise person gravitates to a house of mourning. It's that a house of mourning creates lev chachamim, the heart of the wise. And similarly, it's not that fools are drawn to a house of happiness. It's that a house of happiness makes a person's heart foolish. That seems to be what it's saying over here. So That's it for our time. Let me go back into the main session over here. Okay. Thank you all for joining us. I'm glad we